By the end of 318 BCE, Polyperchon in Macedon was cut off by both sea and land from his ally Eumenes and his vast army. While for Antigonus, with no real threat of Polyperchon and Eumenes coordinating against him, he was afforded the luxury of focusing all his attention on Eumenes and the east. Cassander was left in Europe with the role against Polyperchon, a task made easier by many of the Greek cities sensing a change in fortunes and switching their allegiance to him. However, the situation in the Greco Macedonian homelands was delicately poised, and some bold plays for power would reshape the dynamics permanently. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History. In this episode we're continuing with the Second War of the Diadochi, with events that will reshape the Hellenistic world both in the east and west. But before we jump into it, please like and subscribe as it really helps the channel out. Cheers. In the summer of 317, Olympias, at Polyperchon's request, agreed to take over as guardian to her grandson, the 6-year-old King Alexander IV, son of Alexander the Great. As a result, Olympias returned to Macedon as an ally of Polyperchon. Upon hearing that Olympias was returning, Eurydice, the wife of Alexander the Great's half-brother Philip III, wrote to leading Macedonians, including Polyperchon and Antigonus, renouncing Polyperchon's claim to the regency, and called on them to give the role to Cassander instead. This caused a major rift in the royal house, with the two kings assigned to opposing sides, with both sides now able to claim allegiance to the Argead line. In response to Eurydice, Cassander moved up from the south into Macedon, where he accepted the regency. However, with the fragile situation in the Peloponnesus, he was unable to stay and consolidate his position in Macedon, as he needed to return to the south to continue building his base of support there and eliminating the support for Polyperchon. Once Cassander had returned to the south, Eurydice recognised the danger of the situation she had created for herself, and sent to Cassander requesting military aid to protect against Polyperchon and Olympias, offering gifts and promises to try and sweeten the deal. But Cassander, now engaged in campaigns in the south, was unable to extract himself and come to her aid. Meanwhile, Polyperchon returned to Macedon with his army, taking control of Macedon and restored Olympias and Alexander IV to the throne. Polyperchon travelled with his army to confront Eurydice in Euria, to quickly put an end to the schism in the royal house. His task was easier than he might have wished, as once they got there, when the forces lined up for battle, the Macedonians with Eurydice deserted her for Olympias, out of loyalty to her son, Alexander the Great. Abandoned, Eurydice and Philip Eurydice were captured and taken as prisoners back to the royal court. There they were kept captive in deprived conditions for many days, before Philip was stabbed to death, and Eurydice was given options as to how she wanted to end her own life. With her main rivals out the way, Olympias' rage was not yet sated, and she went on to have Nicanor, brother of Cassander, and 100 prominent Macedonians who had been friends with Cassander killed. Rather than stabilise the court, this caused many to dislike and distrust her, setting up the circumstances for revolution. Meanwhile, in Asia, Eumenes and his men had wintered in the Babylonian villages of Caria, wanting to strengthen his position against Antigonus. He sent embassies to Seleucus, the satrap of Babylon, and Python, the satrap of Media, asking them to support the cause of the kings against Antigonus. Seleucus responded to say that he was willing to fight on behalf of the kings, but would not do so under the command of Eumenes, a Greek responsible for the deaths of many Macedonians, and under a death sentence dating back to the First War of the Diadochi, requesting rather that Eumenes be removed from the leadership of the army. Python and Seleucus sent messages to Antigonus and his silver shields, requesting that they follow through with their wishes. The Macedonians under Eumenes' command ignored this appeal, and marched out of their winter quarters to Carrhae, and set up camp 300 stadies, 34 miles or 55 kilometres, from the city of Babylon on the Tigris River, with the intention of meeting the armies of the upper satrapies in Susa, where he would be able to make use of the funds in the treasury there to fund his campaign. This camp was only briefly used, as the land around it had been plundered, and there was limited food, forcing Eumenes to cross the Tigris to search for food there. Seleucus and Pythion sailed along the river into the camp with vessels that had been built by Alexander's forces during his campaigns, to make another appeal to the Macedonians to remove Eumenes from the command. When this appeal once again fell on deaf ears, Seleucus responded by sailing upriver and opening a canal that flooded the area around Eumenes' camp. This firmly put them and their armies into the anti-Eumenes camp. This flood waylaid Eumenes for a day or two, but he was able to gather enough punts to begin moving his men out from the flooded area. Seleucus, seeing this, and having positioned himself firmly against Eumenes, was in a bind, as he had chosen a side, but did not have sufficient forces to confront Eumenes. To get out of it, he proposed a truce with Eumenes, allowing him free passage through and out of his satrapy. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to Antigonus, requesting for Antigonus to come before the armies of the upper satrapies arrived to reinforce Eumenes. Eumenes managed to get his men back across the Tigris and divided his forces into 3 parts, to look for food in the region around Susa, while sending messengers to the upper satrapies for them to gather their armies and meet him in Susiana. As it happened, the armies of the upper satrapies had already gathered themselves prior to the arrival of Eumenes on the scene. They had the intention of fighting against Python. Python, having been appointed satrap of Media, had become commander of the armies of the upper satrapies. He used his power to execute Philotas, the general of Parthia, and replace him with his own brother Eudamus, and had plans to expand his territory further still. When the satraps arrived in Susiana and joined Eumenes, they held an assembly where there was much rivalry as to who would take the supreme command. Peucestes, satrap of Persia, argued that his large army and high rank under Alexander made him the right man, while Antigonus, the general of the veteran Silver Shields, claimed that the Macedonians who had conquered Asia with Alexander and remained unconquered deserved to take the lead. Eumenes, fearing that their rivalry and division would make them vulnerable to Antigonus, who held firm command of his army, proposed that they should not appoint a single commander, but instead gather daily in the royal tent to discuss matters in the common interest. He again utilised the tent set up with a throne and Alexander's paraphernalia for them to make offerings and hold council, allegedly under the guidance of the deified Alexander. With no group able to establish their own control, all approved his proposal, and he established a daily council for decision-making. Arriving in Susa, Eumenes received money from the treasury for his needs, as the kings had ordered the treasures to be given to him whenever he asked. After paying the Macedonians for 6 months of service, he gave 200 talents to Eudamus, who had brought down the elephants from India, claiming it was merely a regular payment for looking after the elephants, but really trying to purchase his favour, as the elephants were thought to be supremely useful for instilling fear in the opposition, and it was not easy to get more of them. Each of the other satraps supported the troops who had followed him from his territory. While Eumenes rested his troops in Susiana, Antigonus, who had wintered in Mesopotamia, had initially planned to quickly start fighting Eumenes, but decided to slow down and be more cautious when he heard about the satraps and their armies that had joined Eumenes. He began to rest his troops and recruit additional soldiers, realising the war required large armies and thorough preparation. With Python and Seleucus on the out with Eumenes and his alliance, they decided to throw in their lot with Antigonus, who, after receiving their soldiers to bolster his numbers and even up the sizes of the opposing alliances, moved to cross the Tigris River to confront Eumenes. Eumenes set out from Susa in anticipation of Antigonus's move, and positioned his forces along the Tigris, awaiting the enemy's arrival. Needing larger numbers to guard the river bank, Eumenes and Antigonus called on Peucestes to call up a further 10,000 bowmen. He was initially reluctant and bitter about not being appointed overall commander, but was eventually persuaded to provide the reinforcements. Antigonus evaded Eumenes at the river and made his way to Susa, where he'd hoped to resupply his bank account from the treasury there. However, Xenophilus, on Eumenes' orders, refused to accommodate Antigonus's request. Not getting what he wanted, Antigonus appointed Seleucus as satrap of Susa, and instructed him to besiege Xenophilus in the citadel of the city. Leaving Seleucus behind, Antigonus set out towards Eumenes, marching in the night and resting in the day due to the extreme heat, as it was now late June 317 and the height of the desert summer. Reaching the Coprates River, now called the Des River in modern Iran, Antigonus took command of some punts and began ferrying his men across the river, which was about 120 metres or 400 foot wide and flowing quickly. Eumenes learned from scouts that Antigonus was making the difficult crossing and headed his way, setting out across the Tigris, making the relatively easy crossing on his pontoon bridge with a force of 4,000 infantry and 1,300 cavalry, and made a surprise attack on those who had made their way across. Taken completely off guard, despite outnumbering Eumenes, the 3,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, and 6,000 from a foraging party were quickly defeated. Trying to flee back to the river, they overloaded the boats, trying to get them back, causing many of them to sink, and many men to drown in the fast-flowing water, while 4,000 who did not make it that far were taken prisoner by Eumenes. Giving up on his plans to cross the river, Antigonus moved to the city of Boudicca on the Eulis River, between the Passi-Tigris and Tigris rivers in southern Mesopotamia, and allowed his men to rest there to recover from their march. From there, he made the difficult move to Ecbatana in Media, fighting the terrain and the Cassander locals on a 9-day march. Arriving in Ecbatana, he was hoping to use that as a base for gaining control of the upper satrapies, especially while their satraps were busy with Eumenes elsewhere. The previous 40 days had been extremely hard on Antigonus and his men, and he needed to work to regain their faith and happiness, as murmurings of discontent were beginning to fill the camp. Some order was restored, and he sent out Python to gather as many horsemen and war horses as he could, as well as pack animals to make their movements less arduous. Python was able to accomplish his mission relatively easily, and returned with 2,000 horsemen, over 1,000 horses with all their equipment, and sufficient beasts of burden, and 500 talents from the royal treasury. Antigonus organised the horsemen into troops, giving horses to those who had lost theirs, and distributing most of the pack animals as gifts, which helped regain the soldiers' goodwill. Finding out that Antigonus was in Media caused a great stir in Eumenes' army, who were divided on whether to stay in the south as favoured by Eumenes and Antigones, or move north to maintain control of the upper satrapies, as would have been preferred by the satraps of those satrapies. As the disagreement escalated, Eumenes realised that dividing the army would leave neither part capable of fighting independently. Therefore, deferring to the wishes of the satraps from the interior, they left Passi-Tigris and headed to Persepolis, the capital of Persia, a journey that took 24 days. The initial part of the road, up the so-called ladder, was through an enclosed valley, and was scorching hot and lacked provisions. However, the rest of the journey was over highland, boasting a healthy climate and abundant seasonal fruits. When they arrived in Persepolis, the capital of Persia, Peucestes, the general of the satrapy, welcomed them with an over-the-top feast, after performing sacrifices to the gods as well as Alexander and Philip. He gathered animals and other necessary items for the festivities and gave a great feast to the army. With the company of those participating, he formed 4 concentric circles with the leaders in the middle and mercenaries and allies on the outer. In the middle of these circles were altars to the gods and for Alexander and Philip. While the soldiers appreciated and applauded Pukestes' generosity, Eumenes saw it as a threat to his shaky control of the army. To limit the risk, he fabricated a letter, purportedly from Macedon, reporting that Olympias, along with Alexander IV, had retaken control of Macedon and killed Cassander, while Polyperchon had crossed with an army to attack Antigonus from the rear. This news greatly cheered the men, as, had it been true, it would have given them a much greater chance of victory in the war with Antigonus, and worked to shore up Eumenes' position in the camp. With Pukestes managed, Eumenes then sought to ensure his position against rebellion by the other satraps. He did this by borrowing from them large sums of money, supposedly to be used in the cause they were all fighting for, but in reality, making it in the individual satrap's best interest for Eumenes personally to be successful in the war. While he was making these moves in the background, news reached him that Antigonus had broken camp and was on the move from Media into Persia. When he heard this, he decided to set out and meet the enemy head-on, even though it was risky. On the second day of his journey, he performed a sacrifice to the gods and treated the army to another feast. In the feast, some got carried away with drinking and convinced Eumenes to join them. It must have been quite some party, because as a result the army was delayed from marching for a few days, due to Eumenes needing to recover. Once he had recovered sufficiently, the army marched on, with Pukestes, satrap of Persia, and Antigonus, commander of the Silver Shields, in charge, while Eumenes was carried in a litter behind the army. When the armies were a day's march apart, they sent scouts and learned the enemy's size and intentions, and prepared for battle. But they separated before any proper fighting had taken place. The problem was, each army had positioned itself in a strong position to fight when it was with a river and ravine in front, making it difficult for whichever side went on the attack. For 4 days they skirmished and plundered the country, looking for supplies which both sides were beginning to run short on. On the 5th day, Antigonus sent envoys urging the satraps and Macedonians in Eumenes' force to trust him. He offered for the satraps to keep their satrapies, while promising to give lands to some Macedonians, return others with honours and gifts to Macedon, and assign plum rolls to those who wanted it in his army. However, the Macedonians ignored these offers and threatened the messengers, Eumenes' previous actions working to maintain their loyalty for now. During the night of the 5th day, deserters from Antigonus's army informed Eumenes that Antigonus had given the order for his army to break camp during the night with the intention of going to Gabiene, a place about 3 days' march away, with plenty of food and resources to supply the army. As there would be significant advantage to whoever was able to establish themselves in the area first, Eumenes sought to delay Antigonus's departure. To this end, he paid off some mercenaries to pretend to be deserters, and to go over to Antigonus, with the information that Eumenes was going to attack his camp during the night, while he sent off his baggage train and began to break up his own camp to move out. Antigonus fell for the ruse, and had his men line up ready for battle for the night, before scouts came back with reports that Eumenes had already left. Eumenes had a lead of 2 watches of the night, about 6 hours, and so Antigonus's departure now resembled a pursuit and race to Gabiene. To speed his travels, Antigonus handed over control of the infantry and slower moving parts of his army to Python, while he took the fast moving cavalry, and was able to catch up with Eumenes by daybreak. Antigonus positioned his cavalry along the top of a ridge in a position visible to Eumenes. Seeing this, Eumenes halted his march on the assumption that all of Antigonus's forces were present and a battle was about to commence. While Eumenes was preparing his troops for battle, Python and the rest of Antigonus's army was able to join him on the top of the hill, overlooking Eumenes' forces on the plain below. Antigonus was in the prime position for the battle, should Eumenes go on the offensive. However, Eumenes was aware of this, and Antigonus did not have the luxury of time to wait and goad Eumenes into attacking, as his army was still dangerously short on supplies. Observing from his vantage point, Antigonus was able to watch as Eumenes formed up his army. On Eumenes' left wing, hard up against the foothills on that side, he positioned Eurydice with 150 horsemen and elephants from India, along with 2 troops of mounted lancers totalling 50. Next to Eurydice, he placed Cassander with his 950 cavalrymen, followed by a further 600 under the command of Amphimachus, satrap of Mesopotamia. Next to them were a further 600 from Arachosia under Cephalon, followed by 500 each from Parapesade and Thrace. In front of the cavalry he placed 45 elephants with archers and slingers taking up the space between the elephants. Next to the left-wing cavalry he placed his phalanx, of which were not given a number 4, and they were joined on the right by 6,000 mercenaries and a further 5,000 men equipped like Macedonians despite not being Macedonian. Next to them were the 3,000 Macedonian silver shields, the aged but undefeated veterans from Alexander's campaigns, who were joined by more than 3,000 Hypaspes, all under the leadership of Antigonus and Eumenes, leaders of the silver shields. In front of the phalanx he placed a further 40 elephants, and light-armed soldiers filling the gaps between the beasts. On the right wing he stationed more cavalry, 800 from Camarnia, led by Theopolemus, then 900 called the Companions, then the cavalry of Pusestes and Antigonus, who combined into a 300-strong squadron, and then Eumenes' squadron, which contained a further 300. 2 troops of Eumenes' slaves, each with 50 mounted men, were positioned in front as an advance guard. 4 troops, with 200 select horsemen each, guarded the angle beyond the wing's end. Eumenes also stationed 300 swift and strong cavalrymen behind his squadron, and 40 elephants lined the front of the right wing. Diodorus estimates the entire army of Eumenes consisted of 35,000 foot soldiers, 6,100 horsemen, and 114 elephants. As he was able to view the layout of Eumenes' army, on the hilltop Antigonus set up and positioned his men in response, with the aim of countering Eumenes' powerful cavalry and elephant squadrons positioned on Eumenes' right wing. Antigonus's plan was, rather than confront strength with strength, instead to load up his own right wing to go against the relative weakness of Eumenes' left. To accomplish this, he deployed his lightest horseman on the left under the command of Python, instructing him to avoid a frontal attack, but rather use their agility and speed to employ wheeling tactics and frustrate Eumenes' heavy cavalry. He stationed 1,000 mounted archers and lancers from Media and Parthia, who were experienced in these tactics. Next he placed 200 Tarentine cavalry, 1,500 cavalry from Phrygia and Lydia, and 400 mounted lancers, all under the control of Python. Next to them were 400 more lancers, 800 cavalry, as well as a cavalry force called the 2 Horse Men, under Licinius. In the middle, he positioned his phalanx opposite that of Eumenes. It consisted of over 9,000 mercenaries, 3,000 Lycians and Pamphylians, over 8,000 mixed troops in Macedonian equipment, and nearly 8,000 Macedonians. On the right wing, adjacent to the phalanx, Antigonus deployed 500 mercenaries of various nationalities, 1,000 Thracians, 500 allies, and 1,000 companions, with his son Demetrius as commander. At the far right end of the wing, Antigonus himself led a squadron of 300 elite horsemen into battle. 3 troops from his slaves acted as an advance guard, and parallel to them were as many units reinforced by 100 Tarentines. He drew up the strongest 30 elephants in a curved line, filling the interval between them with selected light-armed men. Most of the other elephants were placed before the phalanx, but a few were with the cavalry on the left wing. He advanced slowly down the hill against the enemy, keeping his front line at an angle, with his strong right wing taking the lead, and holding the left back to avoid battle, while preventing the Eumenes' right from ignoring them, but also unable to attack and defeat them, while Antigonus and Demetrius would, all going to plan, decide the battle with the right wing. As the forces met, Python's light cavalry was able to outmaneuver those opposite and attack the elephants from the side, while being able to move out of the way of countermeasures. However, they were a bit too successful in this and caught the attention of Eumenes, who, seeing his right wing under pressure by the light-mounted archers, called on his own lightly equipped cavalry from Eurydice to counter their advantage. Leading this squadron, he attacked with light-armed soldiers and the most lightly equipped cavalry, while his elephants were able to reinforce the attack, causing Python's attack to crumble and turn back towards the hills they had just come down, with Eumenes hot on their heels. Meanwhile, in the centre the infantry engaged in a battle of phalanxes, which resulted in many casualties for both groups. In the end, it was Eumenes' experienced veteran Macedonian silver shields who made the difference. Despite their age, and only consisting of 3,000 men, they became the spearhead of the army. Despite the fact that he had lost on his left and middle, Antigonus ignored calls to retreat. Instead, he kept his section of the army in a tight group, watching as Eumenes' infantry and right-wing cavalry spread out in pursuit towards the hills and Antigonus's retreating men. Antigonus seized on a gap that formed in Eumenes' line, through which he charged with a detachment of his cavalry, straight into the side of Eumenes' left wing under the command of Eurydice, who were taken by surprise at the angle of attack, as they were not formed up to fight in that direction. Antigonus quickly defeated them and inflicted many casualties. While this was happening, he also sent his fastest riders to reinforce and organise his fleeing troops in the foothills. Meanwhile, Eumenes, learning of the defeat of Eurydice, called off the pursuit and consolidated his force. Despite the fact that night was already falling, both sides were eager for victory and manoeuvred into position again under the light of a full moon, 120 metres or 400 feet across from each other. However, exhausted from the events of the day and still lacking in supplies, and unable to gain a positional advantage, as midnight passed, both armies retreated to their own camps. Eumenes wished to return to the camp via the location of the initial conflict, 5.5 or 3.5 miles away, to take care of the dead. However, his men were not interested, and given Eumenes' tenuous grasp on the command, he was unable to overrule his men. This gave Antigonus a significant propaganda win, as, despite many more of his men being killed, he could claim the victory as he took possession of the field of battle and the bodies of the fallen. Seeing that his men were discouraged by the losses they had taken in the battle, Antigonus decided to move out from the area as soon as possible, sending the wounded and the more cumbersome elements of his baggage train to a nearby city for treatment and storage. Meanwhile, in the morning he ensured his men were fed what they could, while also burying their dead, not only out of respect for their fallen comrades, but also to ensure Eumenes would have difficulty ascertaining the severity of the damage done to his army. While this was occurring, a messenger from Eumenes came to make a deal for Eumenes to come and bury his dead. This messenger was held for the day, before being released in the evening with the message that Eumenes could tend to his fallen the following morning. Having done what he could, as night fell, Antigonus broke camp and force-marched his men towards Media, and resupply, as that area was under the command of Python for the winter of 317-316. When Eumenes learned of Antigonus' departure, he held off following, not wanting to test his men too much, and instead focused on making the appropriate funeral arrangements. When Eumenes had finished burying the dead, he likewise moved his army to winter quarters in Gabiene. This was an area that had the supplies they needed to refresh themselves over the winter, which was now setting in. Taking the usual route through the inhabited area, Eumenes and Antigonus were about 25 days' march from each other, although there was a route through the desert of only 9 days if one were bold enough to risk it. That's all for this episode, and next time we're going to take it up as Antigonus takes a gamble. Thanks for being with me, and once again, please like, comment, subscribe, do all that as it helps out, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.